Policy Matters. Policy Matters is a conversation platform which aims to provide reasoned analysis and content to the activities, reforms, and policies of the federal government of Ethiopia.
A very warm welcome to our conversation today. Here with me is Mr. Mamo Mihretu, Senior Policy Advisor to the Prime Minister. Thank you so very much, Mamo, for making time for this. Topic for discussion today is policy reform. It's one of the critical functions of a government in general, but often very less talked about. In his recent address to the Parliament, His Excellency Prime Minister Dr. Abiy Ahmed spoke about the different aspects of policy reform that has been implemented in the country over the last 2+ years. I hope we will expound on these critical reforms in our conversation today. But before delving into that, perhaps let's actually start with the very need for a reform. Oftentimes, whenever there is a change in leadership in many countries, it really comes with a wave of reform. And that's also the case in our country and in our history here in Ethiopia. So really, what inspired the change in Ethiopia over the last 2+ years? Was there even a need for a reform?
Yes, you're right. I mean, reform in Ethiopia seems to come in waves. Every generation in Ethiopia, whether it is the 1960 student generation, or the generation before that, or the current generation, for that matter, seems to be caught up in this existential paradox. On one hand, there is this consciousness about Ethiopia's long history of statehood and pride in being the only African country that remains independent. So that's one source of pride for most Ethiopians. But on the other hand, there is deep awareness about Ethiopia's poverty and backwardness. And just to give you an example, when 1 in every 10 Ethiopian, even now, depends on food aid. Close to 60 million Ethiopians, and that is double of the population of Djibouti, South Sudan, Somalia, Sudan combined, do not have access to electricity. Close to 93% of Ethiopians do not have access to modern sanitation facility. So this awareness about our poverty is also another factor. So in this context, reform, one of the most important objectives of reform, is to address this problem, to achieve shared prosperity in Ethiopia. So the quest for reform in Ethiopia fundamentally is an effort to address the issue of shared prosperity in Ethiopia. But the second point is, it has to do with the construction of the state itself. In the past, the state was not seen as legitimate in the eyes of all Ethiopians. So including Ethiopians in the governance, making sure that Ethiopians can identify with the state is another important subject of reform. Now, the third point has to do with this issue of this cycle of protest and oppression in Ethiopia. And this is because a number of governments in Ethiopia share the democratic deficit. Most Ethiopian governments were not able to ensure democracy in this country. So addressing democratic deficit is an important area of reform. So why reform is needed? Fundamentally, if you distill it, if you synthesize it, reform is needed, number one, to achieve shared prosperity for all Ethiopians. But number two, it has to do with representation. It's making sure that the state is legitimate in the eyes of all Ethiopians is the second important objective of reform. And the third is addressing this cycle of protest and oppression. In other words, addressing the democratic deficit and ensuring people's fundamental right and liberty is respected. So these are the reasons why reform is needed.
You touched upon one important topic, which is democratic deficit, and that actually brings us to one aspect of a reform, which is political reform. In his recent parliamentary address, His Excellency Prime Minister stated, I quote, "The most important thing that's happened in Ethiopia is the formation of a Prosperity Party." Why is that so?
Well, as His Excellency the Prime Minister said, on political space, the most fundamental political reform that happened in recent years is the formation of the Prosperity Party. And there are several reasons why Prosperity Party was formed. Perhaps I would emphasize two important reasons behind the formation of the Prosperity Party. I think the first is there was a clear need to renew the ruling political party through centrist policies, centrist program, and centrist ideology. There was a huge demand from the public for the government to deliver on a number of areas. But if you look at the policy of EPRDF, it tends to divide society along different lines. If, for example, EPRDF's way of working was to establish an opposing reference group and demonize that group. And that is how they mobilize their supporters. It divides society, for example, as narrow nationalists, chauvinists, rent seekers, productive investors, and what have you. So you cannot guide a society to a path of prosperity by dividing it constantly. So there was a need to move away from a politics of division and a politics of exclusion to a politics of hope. And that was the first important reason why Prosperity Party was established. But the second reason is to create a platform for all Ethiopians, all-inclusive platform for all Ethiopians to come together and forge a common vision. If you look at the EPRDF, it was a party of 4 political parties, and it didn't represent Ethiopians fully. It was based on this outmoded ideology and policy that there is a core and there is a periphery. So Prosperity wanted to create all-inclusive political platform where every Ethiopian would come together, agree on a common vision, and forge ahead toward this prosperity with equal responsibility and equal right. So that was the second fundamental reason why Prosperity Party was established. And perhaps quickly, the third reason why Prosperity Party was formed was to streamline decision-making process through the party itself. Instead of 4 different political parties doing their own thing, we'll have one strong platform where decisions are discussed, deliberated, and agreed upon and implemented. So that's also another reason why Prosperity Party was formed. But in any case, the formation of the Prosperity Party is one important and significant political reform that would change the direction of this country for the better.
So some critics claim that the Prosperity Party seeks to form a unitary government. How do you respond to that?
Well, this is absolutely absurd. First of all, people who say that are ultra-nationalist groups that want to keep dividing a society. They know it's not true. In fact, what Prosperity Party wants to do is change the past federalism that used to exist only in name to a true federalism. Now, Prosperity Party respects diversity. It respects and protects the diversity that exists in this country. And by the way, diversity is not a wrong thing. Diversity is something that needs to be treasured. And diversity is not a source of conflict. Tyranny is a source of conflict. Greed is a source of conflict. Diversity is not a source of conflict. So what Prosperity Party wants to do is respect, cherish, and protect diversity, but at the same time, focus on our shared common identity that was forged through marriage, through trade, through blood ties, throughout past Ethiopian history. So, in fact, what the Prosperity Party wants to do is really work on true federalism that would not only devolve power to the regions, but also work towards our shared common identity.
So let me take you to another aspect of reform conversation, which is legal and institutional reform. Tell us a bit more about the work that's been ongoing in this space and its implication and significance for democratization.
Yes, I mean, in the past 2.5 years, a really important work that was happening in this country has to do with creating independent democratic institutions. These, under normal circumstances, would be a work of decade. The government, in an attempt to respond to the desires and needs of the public, worked on creating independent democratic institutions. For example, one of the most important work was the work that was done to make the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission independent. There's also similar work that was done to make the electoral board independent. Independent, politically neutral, and accountable only to the Constitution. If institutions are independent and politically neutral, then they would enjoy the confidence of the public. They would enjoy moral legitimacy. So creating independent democratic institutions was an important area of work for this government. In parallel to that, the government introduced a number of new legislations that expand the space for political participation in Ethiopia. I can give you a number of examples, but just to mention a couple of these new reforms, one has to do, for example, in the area of civil societies, where the government reformed and reversed a law that was repressive in the past. So the new civil society law, for example, create a big space for civil society to participate in public life. Another area of reform was the enactment of the anti-terrorism law. There was a lot of complaint and criticism about the last anti-terrorism laws that we have in this country. This new proclamation protects people's fundamental rights and freedoms, and it makes law enforcement agencies accountable. It creates transparency. By doing that, it balances two important objectives. On one hand, it protects people's fundamental right. On the other hand, it also works towards maintaining law and order. Another important reform that was introduced has to do with the media. So the new media law was enacted, and the media law will guarantee people's freedom of expression to a full extent. People's constitutional right for freedom of expression is also guaranteed through this new proclamation. In addition to this, the government enacted in my view, a very important legislation called Administrative Procedure Code. This essentially protects citizens from unlawful and illegal acts of administrative agencies, government agencies. For example, if an administrative agency comes up with a new rule or with a new directive that affects citizens' right and responsibility, citizens have recourse against that administrative agency. So a number of new laws were introduced in the past 2 years. These are laws that have been discussed for the past, I would say, 10 years, but come to fruition only in the past 2 years. But their ultimate objective is to create an inclusive political space to protect people's fundamental right and freedom.
So let's move to yet another defining aspect of the policy reform conversation, which is economic reform. So there, can you please expound on some of the ongoing works in this space and what it means in terms of creating a more inclusive and a more competitive economy?
I mean, you said it. I think when it comes to economic reform, the overriding objective is to sustain the current economic growth, the current fast economic growth, through a much more robust and active participation of the private sector. The economic reform in Ethiopia can be categorized perhaps into 3 or 4 areas. I think the first area of reform has to do with addressing imbalances and safeguarding macro financial stability. These are the so-called macro reforms. The second area of reform has to do with addressing structural bottlenecks that affected Ethiopia's competitiveness. So these are structural reforms. And third, we are introducing new laws, new policies that would create a competitive investment climate in Ethiopia. Let me just try to explain some of these points because these points are really, really important. On the macro front, a number of measures are being taken, being implemented, including, fiscal policy, reform on the financial sector, addressing foreign currency shortage in this country. But the most important area has to do with making state-owned enterprises more efficient. In the past, Ethiopia's growth was primarily fueled through commercial loan. A number of public enterprises were financing their investment through commercial loan. For example, if you take Ethiopian Railway or Ethiopian Power or Ethiopian Sugar Corporation, 90% of their investment was financed through commercial debt. Because of that, they are not able to service their debt through their cash flow. So addressing that debt distrust, first of all, by making the state-owned enterprise more efficient, and also by avoiding wastage, is a really important aspect of this reform. In this regard, for example, the government is currently introducing innovative instrument to manage the state-owned enterprises' debt burden without destabilizing the macroeconomy. So this was an important area of reform for the government. But the second thing has to do with structural reforms. In a number of areas, we are in the middle of reform. The energy sector is being reformed, first of all, to make electricity available to all Ethiopians, but at the same time, we're trying to expand the space for the private sector to participate in the energy sector. On logistics, we are trying to improve the efficiency of the logistics sector by reducing transit time and by reducing logistic costs. We are reforming the rail sector in Ethiopia. Significant work is currently happening to reform the sugar sector. And of course, you know about the liberalization and privatization of the telecom sector. So all these reforms, when they are properly implemented, would not only make the Ethiopian economy competitive, but will create the strong foundation for a sustained growth in this country. Perhaps one last point on the economic front is the work that's currently happening to improve the investment climate. So a number of policies, proclamations and regulations are currently being reviewed and changed in an attempt to create a competitive investment climate in this country. And some of this you are, of course, aware of. For example, for the first time after 60 years, the government revised and enacted a new commercial code. After 60 years, the last commercial code was enacted during the emperor's time. After 60 years, a new commercial code, a modern commercial code that responds to the needs of the times is enacted. Of course, the investment proclamation has been revised, and this proclamation opened new investment areas, both for the domestic investors and for foreign investors. We are working also very special legislation where the government ratified the so-called New York Convention on recognition and enforcement of foreign arbitral award. I mean, this sounds technical, but for the investment community, this is an important legislation that makes the Ethiopian market quite attractive for future investment. We are pushing ahead in terms of expanding our participation in bilateral, regional, and multilateral trade, including pursuing and advancing WTO accession. So when all these reforms are duly implemented, we will not only make the Ethiopian investment climate competitive, but we will stimulate the productive sector of the economy that would eventually create jobs to the youth of this country. And these are really critical reforms that are happening in the past 2 years, but they will definitely accelerate in the coming decade or so.
So let's move to foreign policy. What has been the key priorities of the government in the foreign policy space and also the strategy in the Horn of Africa?
Well, I mean, it's easy to be distracted by the news cycle and the noise, but I believe fundamentally the future of the Horn of Africa is quite bright. Let's start with the obvious point. The most defining challenge in the Horn of Africa has been the unresolved Ethiopia-Eritrea conflict for a long time. This was not just an issue between Ethiopia and Eritrea, but it was also quite an existential issue for the wider Horn region. This is because the unresolved Ethiopia-Eritrea conflict led to so many proxy conflicts in other countries in the Horn of Africa. For example, if you look at the problem in Somalia, it feeds into Ethiopia-Eritrea conflict and also in turn feeds off this conflict. So resolving the Ethiopia-Eritrea conflict will be a game changer for the Horn of Africa. And for that reason, I believe the future of the Horn of Africa is fundamentally bright. Now, in addition to this, of course, there are also positive developments that we see regularly. I mean, only 2 days ago, Sudan was taken off from the U.S. List of state sponsor of terrorism. When that happens, then it means Sudan can now easily trade with the rest of the world. Sudan now is embraced by the international community, and this can only be a good thing for the Horn region. So fundamentally, when it comes to the Horn of Africa, it is a new horizon of opportunity. It's a new chapter. It is an era of hope. And fundamentally, once the issue of Ethiopia is addressed through the alliance of the Horn of Africa countries, we can now work toward these two objectives. I think the first objective is to create a stable and peaceful Horn of Africa for everyone, where countries in the Horn of Africa are at peace with each other. So this is an important objective. The second thing is we are working toward a closer regional integration in the Horn of Africa region, where goods, services, and people will move freely across this region. So for the Horn of Africa, the vision is one of hope. It's a vision where, as the Prime Minister often said, where minds are open to ideas and borders are open to trade. It's also a vision of goods and services and people and capital are moving across countries in the Horn of Africa. It's a vision of a single market. It's a vision of a closer regional integration among Horn of African countries. It's a vision of opportunity and security for people of the Horn of Africa, finally. So it's a new dawn of hope. It's a new horizon of opportunity for the people of Horn of Africa.
This has been a very insightful conversation. Thank you so very much, Mamo, for taking your time and for elaborating on these critical pillars and aspects of the reform that's been ongoing for the last 2 years. I thank you so very much.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Policy Matters.